So welcome to Views from the Capitol Budget Edition. This one will be probably one of the more interesting budget ones we've done, for sure. I'm glad you all could be here. We're going to work on getting more people in this room. We've maxed out what we've got so far, so that's really great to see. As usual, please put your questions in the chat and we will answer them as we go. We ask you to stay muted so that we can hear what people are saying and the presenters. And we will, as I mentioned, we'll answer the questions that you put into the chat. I'd like to introduce Brenda Pilgrim. If you haven't met her yet, she is our Assistant Director of Government Relations. She's going to help monitor the questions. Liz Cook, our office assistant, she is here to help sort of with the technical things. And then our second presenter, Jason Helson from MSBO. He's here with all of your number information. So we will get started. What happened last week? So as you know, we have been pushing for the $670 million that the governor has said is freed up in the MIPSRS fund because we don't have to make an unfunded liability payment for healthcare. She recommended in her budget using that across the budget in various places. We got together with a coalition of the other education groups, management and labor, and said, instead, that money should go back into the system and be used to lower the rate for all districts who have borne the payments for this unfunded liability. We've been working on that for the last few months. We finally got legislation introduced in both chambers as Senate Bill 911 and House Bill 5803. Those two both would make a permanent reduction in the MIPSRS rate so that going forward, you would know your rate is reduced to a certain amount. Our request was 7% because that's how much was going into the unfunded liabilities for the OPEB or the healthcare side. There were lots and lots of conversations about this. We were winning with legislators, not necessarily winning with leadership, definitely not winning with the governor. As we got closer last week, we finally were presented with a preview of the budget, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But it was given to us to say a 5.75% reduction in the budget, which means it's not permanent, but to reduce the rate by that much, and then no per pupil increase, and a cut to the school safety and mental health per pupil amount, as well as other things within the budget. We were disappointed at best to say that not only was the MIPSR rate not made permanent, so you couldn't count on it, but there was no other ongoing funding that was continued in those big per pupil buckets. We opposed the budget. We sent out alerts. Many of you responded. It was probably one of our biggest alerts we had a response to. We put the pressure on the legislature. We knew we had held back votes. So then they came back to us and to their caucus and said, fine, we will pass Senate Bill 911, which the Senate had already passed. They would amend it to reflect the 5.75 reduction that they were going to make this year, and then put a step down into it so that we would eventually keep moving the rate lower and lower. Not to 7%, it would cap at 5.75, but it was a step in the right direction. It was at least an acknowledgement that it needed to be permanent. So with the agreement that we would move the budget and Senate Bill 911, then it would go over to the Senate. The Senate had agreed to concur, send to the governor along with the budget. So finally, about 2 o'clock in the morning, the House voted on the budget. It passed 56-54, which is strictly party line. Senate Bill 911 came up next. It also passed 56-54. So we thought, okay, we're moving. We moved over to the next chamber, sat around the Senate for a while. They were working on getting immediate effect for both budgets. So there was a lot of just caucusing and conversations. Finally, about 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, they passed the school aid budget with immediate effect. The House passed the general fund budget with immediate effect, and 911 didn't move. We found out later that 9/11 was not even transmitted to the Senate until after they had adjourned, so there was no chance they could have worked on it and passed it. This was maddening, I think is the nicest way to put it. The bill now is in the Senate, but the legislature has adjourned until July 30th. So we are asking, and you can expect to hear more from us on this, we're asking for the Senate to come back on July 30th and move either 9/11, 5803, whatever it takes to codify the MIPSERS rate in law. This is going to be a big push through the month. Conversations continue with the governor's office. They're supposed to be meeting with some of the people of our coalition this week. So we'll see what they have to say. But without that permanent reduction, this is a very tough budget. And some of the press has been, well, there's more money this time because the MIPSERS is more money. But what it doesn't take into account is that you do get the 5.75% reduction in MIPSERS, but you get no ongoing money in your foundation. And you also get a cut to your per pupil school safety and mental health line item. So for instance, I had one district contact me and say they were going to get a $330 per pupil savings with the MIPSERS cut, but they were going to lose $230 per pupil with the school safety cut, which meant they were going to net $100 per pupil under this budget. So these are conversations you need to have internally. These are things that your legislators need to hear. And you can't count on the MIPSERS rate being permanent going forward, which makes all of the budgeting difficult. And I'm going to stop there and let Jason explain how you can pull all that together.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to Jen and the MASB team for the opportunity to join you today. I know we've promoted this within our membership, and so we've got a lot of both school board members and MSBO members online today. One of the key things that I would stress is, we started to hear about this budget deal on June 25th. And we know, practically speaking, on June 25th, you've already passed your budget resolution for fiscal year 24-25. You're down that path. You've made those tough decisions on what assumptions you're going to use. The budget presentation has been done by the superintendent, by the school business official. You've had all those meetings. And so this puts you, no matter what seat you're in a little bit of a difficult situation. And we acknowledge that. Certainly some of this is surprising. And so what we're stressing to folks is, number one, don't freak out. But number two, understand your district numbers. What was the per pupil foundation allowance increase that you used for your assumption? Because almost every district that I talked to assumed that we'd see an increase. The three proposals ranged from, I believe, $217 per pupil up to $302 per pupil. And so we had a range. And if, if you're anything like the average district, you kind of do a middle of the road, best case, worst case scenario. And you probably go on the conservative side early on and make an assumption. And so it's important to understand, what was that revenue increase that you built into your budget and be able to quantify that. Next step, I would definitely encourage you to understand your district demographics, your district payroll, and what is this, what does our slice of the $598 million pie equate to, and how is that going to play out? So if your district payroll is $10 million in salaries in the current year and you're expecting, a 2% increase next year, play that out and be able to quantify some scenarios there and try to come up with an estimate. Now, we do have district impact statements, courtesy of Senate Fiscal Agency. I haven't seen one from House Fiscal Agency yet, but that does give you some estimate on what your district might see. And of course, this is all over the board. It's not a straight, $302 per student, district by district across the board. It varies based on, every district's demographics is a little unique. Your size, your staffing, the age of your staff, all of those sorts of things play into all of this. And so it's not quite equitable across the board. So I'd really encourage you to methodically work through that process, understand how this budget deal differs from what your assumptions were at your June budget hearing. And that would be kind of step one to quantify those and say, Jen gave you one example. District A is about $100 per pupil to the benefit, but some districts we know are not going to see that benefit. So I'm going to run down some of the key points in this budget, and we'll wrap up with MIPSers because obviously that's the big issue on everybody's mind. So what we shared with our membership on Thursday, and of course, the headline, I believe, in all of this is no foundation allowance increase for fiscal year 24-25. And this was certainly a surprise to me. We knew that during these negotiations, during trying to whittle away at those MIPSers costs for districts, trying to get some long-term relief, that there might be some changes, but I don't believe that we anticipated that it would go to zero. And so that per pupil amount remains at $9,608 for this fiscal year 24-25 upcoming. And for cyber schools, it's at $9,150. Now, they didn't see an increase in last year's budget, and the same is true for this year's budget. Charter schools or PSAs, and again, this is not a judgment call, but we saw a unique categorical filled in through Section 22E. If you remember back in the days of equity payments, where districts might see an additional per pupil amount, this has somewhat the feel there. But charter schools or PSAs will see a one-time per pupil increase of 3.9%. And I believe that's going to be $375 per pupil. So that's not, while it's not rolled into the foundation allowance, that brings that total per pupil funding to $9,983 by my calculations. Jen mentioned a significant cut with Section 31AA, mental health and school safety. And I think that's the next headline down as I'm bringing it in order of importance possibly to our members. So we saw over $300 million this year distributed through this section, and that's brought down to $25 million for fiscal year 24-25. Now, again, this gets a little tricky because we had one-time funding for fiscal year 23-24, but we also know well and good that we saw one-time funds for many years in a row through this section, and that's been a very important thing. I talked with many of our school business official groups throughout the spring, but also several superintendent groups throughout the spring, talking about budget proposals and budget options. And to a T, each one of them said that this was very high priority, that they had added programs, they had added staffing, in many cases added SROs to their districts. And they felt that that was very important for school safety overall. We see continued increases in investments for Section 30D for universal meals, Section 31A for at-risk, and Section 32D for GSRP. So this follows the trend of recent years. We've heard a lot about the School Finance Research Collaborative and the weighted average per pupil funding model. And this follows in that path. And we know some of our key legislators in leadership positions are really strong proponents of that. 30D universal meals, we heard throughout the year last year, has been popular in the sense that meal counts are up and students are eating and meal claims are up from districts. And so that reaches a total of about $200 million per year going into next year. 31A at risk, of course, uses the opportunity index. And we see a pretty, pretty significant increase investment there. And Section 32G GSRP, of course, has been a priority of the governor and this administration to try to get to universal access. We see moving up to 400% of the federal poverty level. We see an increase of about $85 million in base funding and $50 million in other GSRP subgrants in this budget cycle. One new section that has a not insignificant price tag was Section 35M for literacy supports. And I believe this may have come out of dialogue around, the dyslexia bill package and overall, literacy supports. And I think it was kind of a trade-off, one or the other. And 35M for literacy supports appears to have won out with a price tag of $87 million. We see continued funding with no increases over fiscal year 23-24 levels in some key areas. And this is not exhaustive, but these jumped out at me as I read through the budget the first couple times. Section 22L for transportation reimbursements. Section 27A for Michigan Future Educator Fellowship, excuse me. Section 27C, Michigan Future Educator Student Teacher Stipend Program. Section 29 for enrollment stabilization. We know declining enrollment is an issue around the state. We're down around 200,000 students since the implementation of Proposal A and over 300,000 students since our high in the early 2000s. And so it's a pretty universal issue. Section 29 was implemented last year to try to fund 50% of the year-over-year student enrollment loss and fund that through state aid. Of course, it was prorated at about 75% factor. We saw the House proposal proposed to increase that to fully fund that. Ultimately, that failed. So we expect we'll probably see a proration factor again in next year's budget. Section 81 for ISD operations stays at the same level as fiscal year 23-24. And again, this was something that was proposed to be increased during the various proposals and in the end was held flat. Of course, we see elimination of many one-time sources from the fiscal year 23-24 budget. And with over $2.3 billion in one-time appropriations, we knew that this was coming. So it was certainly expected. There are too numerous to mention here, but it's really important to understand where your district may have benefited from these. And I know we've got lists of those within the Senate fiscal and House fiscal document as well. Of note, there's a list on page 32 of the House Fiscal Agency Analysis document for those that wish to review in more detail. And I'll try to share that link here in a second.
I put the
Overall,
link up, Jason, for the House
Wonderful.
Fiscal Analysis.
Wonderful, thank you.
So they can take a look at that.
So overall, we see a decrease of about $900 million in total. And if we remember back a few years, talking about a huge carry forward balance in the school aid fund at one point over $4 billion. It's natural that we're going to see some decline over time as we use some of those one-time sources and spend up some of that fund balance. But that doesn't necessarily lessen the blow unless you're ready for it in your district plan and your district budget. So with about 164 sections in the school aid fund, that's a very high level view, right? We don't have time to go through each and every single one. But we're trying to provide as much information on our website, msbo.org, as possible, as well as through venues like this. As expected, the debate over MIPSers really drove the budget negotiations, as Jen mentioned. So I'll run through Section 147, which is where all of these MIPSers or Michigan Public School Employment Retirement Services.
Hey, Jason.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before we jump to MIPSers, there's a couple other questions in the chat because I know there's going to be MIPSers questions as we go. So one was, there's a couple of whys. Why was there no increase to the per pupil? Why was there an increase for charters and not traditionals? I can't totally answer that, but sure. The idea is coming from the budget office and the powers that be, that the MIPSers rate reduction would be more than you would have gotten in the per pupil allowance that was under any of the three budgets. Our issue with that is per pupil is permanent and ongoing. The MIPSers is not permanent. We don't know what's going to happen next year. So the idea that they came back to us with no foundation allowance and are saying we wanted MIPSers and not that is misleading at best. But I think that is their reason for no foundation. The increase in charters is there because charters don't pay into MIPSers. So the thought was they would give them an increase to kind of match what we were getting with MIPSers. So I think that's their rationale, but I also don't want to pretend to climb into the minds of leadership and the state budget office. Another question was, how do we find out how much you got cut under the safety grant? I think that's an individual district business officer question because it was given to you on a per pupil basis. So I can't tell you exactly how much, and I'm not sure that it's reflected in the fiscal analysis. But that would be a question you should be able to ask your business office. There was
That's not one that I have off the top of my head, but that's definitely one we can follow up on and get a better answer for, yes.
I did put in the chat the House fiscal analysis and the district by district summary so that you can find those as well. And then it looks like the last two questions are about MIPSers, so I'll hold those. Let me just do one quick check. With the major last minute changes, do they realize what they did to schools in the long run? That is a good question for your legislators and the budget office. 147.
If I can
Okay,
just,
it looks like the rest of the questions are MIPSers, so go ahead.
well, if I can provide a little bit of maybe high level context there when we talk about per pupil foundation allowance, 31 AA mental health, and the MIPSers money. The executive budget recommendation that came out in February, which is really the starting point for all of this, right? February 7th or so, the governor presents this budget recommendation, talks about a $241 per pupil increase. That would be an ongoing year after year cost at this point of $316 million. And so, so that gives you some sense of the scope of this. The last couple of years, we've seen an increase of over $450. It was on the order of around $600 million statewide. So that gives you, some sense of the overall cost. But that $316 million that was originally proposed, in this conference committee deal goes away. And again, we'd see about a $275 million decline in the 31 AA. Now, again, it gets a little tricky in terms of how we talk about that or how you might see that in the news, because technically that was one-time funds for fiscal year 23-24, although districts have grown to rely on that because you have gotten it year after year now for several years running. And so so that gives you some sense of the scope of what the cost of those increases or decreases would be versus 598 million in order to buy down that rate, or the 670 million that we've been hearing about since that February date. So as we go down the list for section 147 in the budget, which is where all these MIPSers items live, again, I see about $631 million in school aid fund savings, which is directed to other priorities. And Jen talked about that. Really, we see the OPEB, or the retiree health, is in great shape. It's fully funded. We no longer need to contribute to that ongoing, is what we're hearing. And so that can be spent on other priorities. And really that debate this spring has been about, are they going to go to other priorities, or are they going to go back to districts? So we see the top line rate is listed at 48.23% of payroll. And certainly some of us have been around schools for a while. When I first got into schools, it was in the neighborhood of 12%. And I hear stories, going back of 5% contribution. And of course, that's changed over time, and there's been a different approach over time to that unfunded liability and that debt. But that goes from 48.23% down to 41.94% of payroll for fiscal year 24-25. And now we'll get into the revenue sources that your districts are going to see. So section 147A1 was $100 million last year. It remains at $100 million for next year. Section 147A2 sees a slight increase of about $5 million, and that is about $365 million statewide. This was as expected in the budget proposals, so no real change there. 147A3 was implemented this year to include ISDs, which never got that resource before. it stays at $12 million. It was at 12 million, it stays at 12 million, and that was as expected. 147A4 is introduced and represents a significant increase. And so here's where the $598 million comes in from the last minute deal. This is projected to offset 5.75% of payroll costs for districts in fiscal year 24-25. And again, Jen has talked about this. This is not really an ongoing guaranteed basis. It's not specifically flagged as one time, but it does appear to be a compromise reached in lieu of that permanent rate reduction, which was sought. And that's been hotly debated. And of note, there is language in there that says that it is the intent of the legislature that the allocation under this subsection be used to support mental health, school safety, the educator workforce, and academic interventions. And so found that interesting, possibly a little amusing that, it's in a spot where it doesn't necessarily belong, where we're talking about retirement costs. So I think that there's a lot to be sorted out here. Is this going to be offset money? Is there going to be a rate reduction? More to come for sure on all of this. And definitely I've gotten some questions through my inbox that I've passed along already. And we'll be working on this and certainly following it up throughout the summer. So Jennifer's question in the chat. So are we going to receive revenue of 5.75 and still have to record expense? I think so. I think that's the deal. But again, I think more guidance and more clarification is needed here. Section 147C, our old friend, which is really the stabilization piece. Districts get that money and pass it back to ORS. And that's been part of the overall pay down plan for a number of years. We see a significant decrease here. And again, this was part of the governor's plan from the start. This decreases by $574 million. And I see this as the corresponding piece to the reduced UAL stabilization rates, significantly lowered subsidy funding. We also see our old friend, Section 147C2, pop back up in the amount of $250 million. That'll be distributed to districts and passed back to ORS. And again, more guidance is needed in terms of what that's actually going to mean. Section 147E is pretty small in the scheme of things, increases slightly. It's $104 million statewide for fiscal year 24-25. This was expected in the budget proposals. Section 147F is eliminated. This was an offset of 0.5% of your total district payroll. And that's a loss of about $49 million statewide compared to fiscal year 23-24. This was expected in the budget proposals, but you'll need to be aware of this as this is a net loss to district budgets. And then Section 147G is also introduced. And this is where it gets even stickier, possibly. This provides $181.5 million in one-time funds for districts to reimburse employees for their 3% healthcare contribution. So part of this overall MIPSR's negotiation has been employees are paying 3%. If districts don't need to pay in, maybe employees don't need to pay in either. And so the MEA really got behind this and said, let's eliminate that 3% deduction. Of course, we didn't get there, but we did get funding for this. Now, how might this impact your district and your district offices? It sounds like district payroll offices will continue to deduct the 3% healthcare deduction and remit that to ORS. And that districts will receive funding from the state to reimburse them. And then districts will pass that reimbursement back to employees to keep employees flush or flat for the 3%. Possibly a lot of extra work for your district business office and administrative offices. Possibly a great benefit to our teachers and other staff. My wife's a teacher. She pays that 3%. She could potentially benefit from this, but a lot of questions that I've gotten already. Is this taxable income? My gut says yes, but I don't know for sure. And I'm not going to offer you tax advice in this forum. How is this going to work? How is the timing going to work? I have no idea just yet. Certainly ORS needs to be involved in this process. And so, as sometimes happens, a compromise that maybe makes more work for our offices. I know our membership does a really nice job of hunkering down and getting things done and not always getting the thanks for it. And this appears to be one of those other, gifts that keeps on giving. We thought we had put 3% in the refunds to bed a while ago, and it seems like it pops back up. So with the bulk of the new and increased district funds coming through 147, rather than a flat per pupil increase, the district impact can vary significantly. I've seen anywhere in the 300s up to over $600 per pupil, depending on district demographics and your district staff makeup. So it's really important to understand, your district staffing, your district costs, and your payroll totals to accurately gauge the benefit to your district. It's unlike things that we've seen in the past, for sure. The governor's press release estimated the impact at $400 per pupil statewide. But like I said, we know that this is going to vary significantly from district to district. And it certainly can be more complicated to explain to your school board, your community, your employee base, all of that, than an across the board per pupil foundational allowance increase. Jen, I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat, but I'm not really keeping up.
Yeah, there's a lot. So I think you covered a lot of them. One question, will they factor in the cost of tax and retirement that we and the employees will have to pay when they calculate our allocations?
An excellent question. I've always seen one district quick analysis of this that would suggest that no, they haven't. But again, it's just one data point, and I haven't had a chance to dive in.
And I think you spoke to this, but I'll ask just in case. The offset is coming in through 147A4. It's not an actual reduction in the expense we pay to ORS.
I believe that's what we're going to see, that we're going to see offset revenue, that you'll continue to pay that rate and that you'll see a significant increase to your offset revenue, that it will help your bottom line, but it won't actually decrease your net ORS costs. But there is language in there that says effectively reduce each participating entity's unfunded actuarial accrued liability from 20.96 to an estimated 15.21% of covered payroll. So it's not entirely clear to me how this is going to play out and how it's going to be carried out going forward.
Message. So you mentioned that some districts will see a $300 increase and some up to $600. What types of districts are on each end and what are the factors? And I'm guessing this has to do with payroll. Is that true?
Definitely. I would say, what are your, I've used the word demographics, but are you heavy on people, or are you a little bit heavier on purchase services and goods and supplies? And so, this is not to pick on anybody or single anybody out, but Oakland Schools shared a chart on our listserv. And so I'm looking at that right now, and that suggests an Oakland County average of $438 per student. But I see a range from $337 to $660 per student when it's broken down on an individual district basis, anywhere from 3.51% up to 6.87% of the foundational allowance, the 9608. And so that's where it gets really tricky. And I think we can look at, a wide range. These allocations, they're going to look at covered payroll by district. And so what's your employee base? Do you have a senior staff versus a junior staff? Do you have high staffing levels, lower staffing levels? All of those things are going to play a factor in these calculations.
If retiree healthcare is now overfunded, why don't they do something for the retiree healthcare instead of going backwards to the people who are still paying 3%? Maybe people who didn't choose to pay 3% would have chosen differently if they thought eventually they wouldn't have to. So the 3% wasn't really a choice. It was employees hired before 2012. What they're trying to do is not make them pay that anymore because it's unnecessary. So there's about 103,000 teachers across the state, or staff across the state, that are paying this 3%. It's not everyone, which has been some of the confusion around the legislature. But that's what they're trying to do for those staff. The way they did it in the budget, as Jason mentioned, is very clunky. The policy bills that we're talking about to make the MIPSERS rate permanent would remove that requirement completely. So they wouldn't have to pay it anymore. It just wasn't done cleanly because they didn't do the policy bills.
But also, to Pam's point, folks that were employed pre-2012 did have a choice between the PHC and the PHF. And so they may have opted for the 2% and 2%. It wasn't just those folks that were hired later on. And so, yeah, I haven't heard anything recently, Pam, about reopening that conversation.
No, I wouldn't expect them to reopen that at all. We've tried to get them to reopen conversations about the systems that exist. There are so many different ones, and they've never really been willing to do that.
I did see one question about, is this 3% issue retroactive? And I believe absolutely not, that this is just looking at it going forward. I don't believe there's been any discussion about going retroactive.
No, this is not retroactive. So assuming if the policy bills pass, the flow through to reimburse the 3% would go away. Yes, we'd have to repeal that section as well, but that would be the goal. Are there any more MIPSERS questions before we move on to some of the other changes within the budget? Immediate effect, what does that mean? So immediate effect means that it will take effect as soon as the governor signs the bill. So as soon as she signs the budget, certain sections of the bill go into effect right away. Other things that are for the 24-25 fiscal year go into effect October 1. But without immediate effect, the bill wouldn't go into effect until 90 days after the legislature adjourned for the year, which they're not expected to do until December. So getting immediate effect on the budget was extremely important because we weren't sure what would happen if they didn't do it. And then we couldn't have a budget until March. So that's why immediate effect has been so important.
John, one more question that I see alluded to in the chat, and if you don't have an answer, that's fine. But I know that there was a supplemental for 23-24 and all of this. And to be honest, I haven't researched it a whole lot, and I don't know if you've had much of a chance to look at it as well. But I've gotten a couple detailed questions about that. I didn't know if you had any insight there. If not, I'm happy to follow up with those folks later.
Yeah, it's spread within the budget, so it doesn't stick out as these are supplemental for this year. So I don't have all that yet. There is talk about doing another supplemental when they come back in the fall. So we may still see changes to the budget before it goes into effect in October 1. But we don't know what that's going to look like, and I don't even want to speculate.
Sure. I guess, thank you for that. And my last comment also alludes to a few of the questions or comments in the chat. And it's the deal about ongoing versus one time. And that's really what I would come back to and stress that, if we're getting a one-time MIPSERS impact, that's nice, but that's not the same as getting ongoing baseline foundation allowance increases that we can count on year after year. And so I think that really stresses the importance of this whole discussion about Senate Bill 911 and really understanding your district picture and perspective and having a long-term plan to make sure you're on solid financial footing no matter what happens with all of this.
So the last question, and then we'll move on because this sort of is a good segue, is the state made available a great deal of funds over the past few years for school safety. However, many of these funds have ongoing costs. Additionally, the issues and concerns are not going away. How does the legislature justify such a significant cut? And I think that's a great question for your legislators. We brought this up to them, and like the idea that it was per pupil, it was one of the most flexible categoricals we had and was a great benefit to districts. I don't know what to tell you as far as these things going forward. The stock answer we would receive is, well, we're giving you the MIPSers money. So it was there was a lot of consternation at the end as we were talking about all this, but I don't know how much thought was given to the idea that safety issues are not a one-time fund. So hopefully as we go forward, this is something we can address. It's the one rumor I've heard about a supplemental is that they will address the safety money. But again, I don't want to put hope in anyone's mind right now, because after what we've been through the last few weeks, I don't know what will happen as we go forward in the fall, but it's definitely conversations we're having. I really strongly urge you to reach out to your representatives and senators. It's going to take grassroots push to get some of these things addressed. And when they really start to hear what this budget's doing to their districts, hopefully they will start to listen a little bit more. Real quick before we move on, what is the current ORS UAL rate, Jason?
So question. The stabilization rate, the current rate is 16.89%. I believe that's set to go down to 10.58 for next year with this deal. In terms of, not sure if that's what the individual is asking, but that's the one that sticks out in my head. I know there are other pieces of the contribution that go to UAL, but that stabilization rate is the state subsidized, the in and out piece.
All right, the last question before I move on is, how accurate are the per district numbers in the House Fiscal Agency? It's as accurate as they can make them. I suggest always double checking your numbers within your own business office, but House Fiscal generally does a very good job of figuring out the state funding for each district. So I would still double check, but they are very solid numbers. So we want to talk about just a few of the other things that are included. Some of the boilerplate language that has been changed. You heard a lot through the budget cycle about the governor wanting universal pre-K. And her proposal, when she put her budget out, was to remove all income eligibility limits in the Great Start Readiness Program so that anyone could apply to the Great Start Readiness Program. It also went further and talked about per pupil into other sorts of preschool programs. Our issue at the time was that districts don't have capacity to take on all 4-year-olds right now. We supported the steps that the Senate and House suggested, continuing to move the percentage up. But in the final budget, it does remove that percentage. So anyone qualifies for GSRP. However, districts must give priority to those families under 400% of the poverty level. If you have slots available after you have enrolled all of the applicants under 400%, then you may use anyone above that and they do not have to pay tuition. We have found there were a lot of sections that added individual pork projects. You hear that a lot, but there are 3 sections that deal with individual sorts of things from districts. One of the sections is infrastructure. The infrastructure funds are not available yet because we haven't completed the study. However, there are a list of districts within that section that could still qualify for money for very specific reasons. And then under the before and after school programs, there are, again, a list of very specific programs in specific districts that can be covered under those. We've never really been fans of doing things like this. I know that districts do benefit, but calling out one district and not another is always problematic. But unfortunately, that is continued in this budget. We also talked a lot about Section 56 and how MAISA and the special education folks were working to get that budget equal or the millage equalization rate fixed. The way it is written now was intended to make things more even among districts, but it hasn't really worked that way. So a lot of work was put into trying to figure out how to make that work. Each budget, the governor, the Senate, and the House had a slightly different version of that, but this final budget has nothing. The formula will remain the same. Work on that is going to have to continue. We mentioned that the House added 164J, which would have penalized anyone that used state funds for suspected violations of PARA, the collective bargaining piece, that you would have, if you use state funds to defend yourself, you would have to pay back to the state the same amount that you used. We fought very quickly and very hard against that because it had such broad implications and really set up the idea that if an unfair labor practice were to be brought to the district can't use state funds. It would have to use district funds that weren't given to them by the state to defend themselves. However, if for some reason the tables were switched and you filed the unfair labor practice, you still couldn't use state funds to do that, even though the other party was at fault, possibly. So we finally did get that removed. There will be no longer will there be extra penalties under PARA. Literacy supports, this was a line item that we had issues with. She removed some of it, but not all of it. So there is money under this line item that would create a commission to rank literacy tools from best to worst. And then when they put that list out, districts using the best of the tools would receive a higher per pupil than districts using the lesser of the tools. The idea was to incentivize those districts at the bottom end to choose better tools so they would receive more money. Our concern is that they're going to say that people with lesser tools get less money. Well, then it's harder to switch to a better tool. So it's in there. I'm not sure how effective it will be. We'll have to keep an eye on that. And then finally, this has come up in the chat too. And I think Jason mentioned it, but it's worth saying again. The governor put in her press release that school safety funding is up to 133 million. This is accurate, but misleading. The 31 AA, that per pupil that comes out to you, is the one that was cut so drastically, down to 25 million across the state. But if you add that to Section 31N, which is the section where you can hire staff and use services for a better Medicaid drawdown, that is 108 million. If you add those together, you get to 133 million. We think that's where that number is coming from. It's a combined amount. And let's be honest, it sounds better than 25 million. So your 31 AA is being drastically cut, no matter what the press release says about the final number. One of the questions for clarification, anyone qualifies for GSRP, but priority is given to those less than 400% of the poverty level. It would be more than 400% of the poverty level. So they're moving the 300% you're at now to 400%. That's your priority class, is 0 to 400% of the poverty level. And then if you have slots left, then you may admit them without them having to pay tuition. So it is still looking at the lowest income kids to be in GSRP first, and then expanding to other kids. This was sort of the nod to we can't take everybody all at once, but it still does remove all of the other income thresholds that were there. Are there any other questions about the budget? Technically, it is $25 million in new funding, but it was supposed to have been 150 to 300 million in new funding. So I saw earlier about the budget being presented. The budget, I believe, has been presented. I'd have to double check, but no, she's not signed it yet. I would expect her to sign it quickly once she gets it. I don't know about line items. As far as the school aid budget goes, I would think there won't be a lot of line items. I don't know what the general fund looks like. But because of how the negotiations went down on this, I don't expect her to line item much in the school aid budget. And a last question for you, Jason. Are ISDs included in the 147A for new funding?
I believe so. We look at the district. Let me look at district by district analysis. Yes, there is a district impact for ISDs listed under 147A4. So I believe so, yes.
$670 million was freed up, 598 went to buy down the rate. Where did the rest get allocated? Jason mentioned in the comments some of the governor's priorities. That is exactly where they would have gone, into the literacy pieces, the 30 million extra that they needed in meals, but really the largest amount of money went toward pre-K. There's other stuff spread throughout the budget where the money could have been. There's no way to know which dollar is which. But those were the governor's priorities. So we would expect that that's what she wanted the money freed up for. Any other questions that we can try to answer for you? This is being recorded. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will get it edited down and sent out, if not today, then tomorrow. So that for those of you that are here, if you wanted to double check something, or for the people who weren't able to get in the beginning, if any of those are your colleagues, you can share this with them. If we're being asked to update our revenue as a district from our proposed budget, would you suggest we do the following? Update section 22 to show no increase, reduce 31AA to $17 per pupil, and include a 147A4 section. It's Kara's question in the chat, Jason. It might be easier for you to read.
Yes, that's those are kind of the first three steps that I would absolutely recommend that you take. Look at your foundation allowance assumption. Maybe, if you said, hey, we went on a $100 per pupil or $50 per pupil increase, I would have said a couple weeks ago, well, you're being conservative. I would support that. So evaluate where you're at there. Definitely, you probably expected 31AA to continue. So evaluate where you're at there, quantify how much that is in total and per pupil and in number of positions, and really start to dig into that MIPSers piece. But yeah, 5.75% of payroll is going to be your key number there. And also look at 147C, because that looks like it has followed along the lines of what the governor proposed back in February. But yeah, those would be my first three moves in evaluating and communicating where we were at in terms of what the board passed a few weeks ago versus where we're at now.
Can you talk about the two-year college funding? Unfortunately, no. I've been so wrapped up in just the K-12 budget, to be perfectly blunt. No, I don't know about it yet. I am looking into it. It would be part of the community college budget, and it's my understanding they're taking one of the programs about the return to community college, which was for people over a certain age, and dropping that so that 18 would qualify for that. And that's how they're opening that up. But I don't have the details on that, and I have not had a chance to look at them, so I apologize. 5.75 of which year's payroll? 24-25 estimated? Is that what they should look at?
The just looking at my notes again, sorry. This is definitely something we're going to address either this summer or this fall, because we get a lot of questions about these section 147 allocations and how they get factored. Trying to buy time so I can find that language. Allocated based on your payroll from the immediately preceding fiscal year, meaning fiscal year 23-24 payroll base. So that's my best guess right now. Let's take your total 23-24 payroll times 5.75%. As always, subject to change, but we'll communicate as we go along.
And you can expect to hear both from us and from MSBO as we go through the summer. Trying to get that MIPSR's policy bill passed will make a difference in what you're looking at. And if they decide to do a supplemental, will make a difference. So stay tuned. The legislature is off now until the Senate will come back July 20th. I don't think the House comes back until after the primary. Being an election year, there aren't a lot of session days between now and election day. But we hope that we can get some movement on the MIPSR's questions in July in the Senate. And then I would think if they're going to start looking at a supplemental, it would probably be September. So we will keep you posted best we can. If you ever have questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Jason, to Brenda, and we will do our best to answer them. Thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate all of your work and your advocacy over the last couple of weeks. We can't do this job without you, and we hope we can support you in the same way. Thanks for being here. Enjoy your summer.